Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this edition of neighborhoodnewsstudio.com. We have a very good lineup today. We have kicking it off will be Mr. John O'Loughlin, McDuff Lives, and his guest, Harley Schlanger of the Schiller Institute. Good morning, John. Good morning, Harley.
Good morning.
Good morning to you.
How are both of you doing?
We are raring to go.
After their broadcast, we have at noon, we have investigative journalist George Webb, who's still in Europe. Then we have at 2 o'clock, Housatonic Live with Mark Kulak and special guest West Coast Carol. At 4 o'clock, we have Chris, the IP Hunter. And we have at 5 o'clock, the Duke Report with Peter Duke. So I'm going to, at this point, hand it over to John and let you take it away.
Thank you very much, John Wilkins, back there in Temperance, Michigan, the neighborhood news studio, home base. And we thank you for that nice introduction. And here's the Ospreys to introduce everyone to our show here at McDuff Lives 3. And we're co-broadcasting with the former channel, or the big channel, McDuff. It's called McDuff Got 2 More YouTube Strikes. Go to McDuff Lives 3. That's the name of the channel. So we're broadcasting in both places because I don't think we're going to get in any trouble today. I keep 3 channels in case we have some sketchy content that somebody at YouTube might object to. So, but anyway, sorry for that diversion, and welcome, Harley. It's great to have you back.
John, I don't know if we criticize the censors, does that get you a strike?
No, criticizing the censors. Well, you send a note to YouTube. That's what you do, or Twitter in the case. You just have to get them from behind. You have to get their attention to say, hey, you're doing something wrong. Otherwise, the AI just rules everything. It's just the AI world. You can't talk to a human.
Well, I wonder where the fact checkers get their facts.
Oh, they get it from the Ministry of Truth, of course.
And that's why it's so obtuse.
Yeah. Well, everything from the Ministry of Truth can be believed, or else, they wouldn't have to make it up.
Well, it's so much that is oriented toward discrediting any disagreement and then censoring it so you can't know whether you agree or disagree. Right. So it's a very neat package they're presenting now.
Yes. And well, I warned you I was going to toss a quote at you from Stephen Kinzer's book, The True Flag 2019 book, in which I've done 5 shows on it already. I found it to be fascinating because you and I were talking 2 weeks ago about the so-called Panic of 1907 and how that devolved into the beginnings of the government financing banks in order to keep the financial system going. And I'm looking, I look behind that and found this book to be very useful because this book shows me where the empire started, and they were blatantly calling themselves imperialists. Mm-hmm. And there were 3 people that were the key that made it happen: Henry Cabot Lodge Sr., the older one, who was the top Boston Brahmin of the era.
Yeah.
Theodore Roosevelt, who was Lodge's man, which I'd never knew, but he was Henry Cabot Lodge's guy. And then the third one was William Randolph Hearst. And he controls, he built the New York Journal, and he built the whole idea of a penny paper that everybody could get access to. And so that was the trio, which I think today are represented by the media. You could put Rupert Murdoch or anybody else's face on it, but the Hearst of today, the Roosevelt of today is a kind of a weak figure, Biden, but nevertheless, he's the face in front of the policy. Mm-hmm. And then you have the Lodge interest behind it, And I don't know how to best describe it. It's not the same that Lodge, the same interest that Henry Cabot Lodge represented or his legacy. It's something different that comes more from the British Wall Street connection than from anything that Lodge wanted. It's fascinating that Lodge, I think, represents the last hurrah of the westward ho empire. The manifest destiny. We're going west and we're going to go to Hawaii. We're going to take the Philippines. We're going to take China. We're going to create new markets. And it was all about we needed big markets. It was always about we can't sell enough of our stuff to American people. We're saturated. We keep making it. We got to sell it. And that's where empire comes from. Now, indulge me if I just read this one little quote over this is the question of 1898. Is the United States going to annex these Spanish possessions and Hawaii? Or are we going to set the people free to have their own destiny? And the answer was given by Lodge that we are an empire. We are going to keep going. We are going to expand our markets. And this is going to be a blessing for those benighted savages that don't know how great it's going to be when we get there. You know, it's the same story, you know, from Columbus to today, but that was the driving factor. And here's the quote I wanted to give you from Senator John Tyler Morgan of Alabama, who co-sponsors Lodge's resolution to annex Hawaii. And he says, it was foolish to dwell on constitutional niceties when vital interests were at stake.
Comes right from the voice of the administration today, isn't it?
Exactly. That was my point. And I think, you know, I'm going to keep going with this book. I've read 3 Kinzer books already, and I love, you know, the facts that he puts together. He's a great writer. I'm still not convinced of his basic theme, you know, that we, the American people, do this. You know, I think it's them. It's those Wall Street manipulative evil ones that do this, and we're just carried along, and our good name is attached to it. But I don't like to take responsibility for this horrible stuff in the world. Anyway, that was my question, and I think you already answered it. Are we not seeing the same thing now that our true flag, the flag of George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, the Revolution, you know, the freedom of the slaves, that true flag has been converted and taken away from us to the use, you know, converted to the use of a false entity, the deep state, or whatever you want to call it, and that is the empire. That is the idea that we have to continue making an empire. And so here we are trying to knock down Russia, because if we can knock down Russia, well, that just almost completes our empire. And we're at that same stage now. That, you know, do we take Hawaii? Do we take the Ukraine? Do we take Russia?
Well, if you take these 3 people that you mentioned, Lodge is sort of a composite of the banking crowd today, the banking and finance crowd, which includes incorporated Silicon Valley. Lodge in particular, the Boston Brahmins were a key element of an attempt to sabotage the American system, working together with the New York bankers and the plantation owners of the South. And LaRouche has written extensively about this. Anton Chaikin, a historian who's an old friend of mine, has written about it. Graham Lowry wrote about the previous period when you had the emergence of a Republican grouping in the 17th and 18th century, in the 18th century, a Republican grouping that saw the British Empire as the enemy. Well, Lodge and his ilk saw the British Empire as something to aspire to. Mm-hmm. And one of the connecting links there was a historian and a military figure, Alfred Thayer Mahon, who wrote the book on the influence of sea power in history, which he used to urge that the United States, with its economic strength, should naturally ally itself with the British Empire. and look to Britain as the great miracle because it's a sea power. It doesn't have a whole lot of raw materials, but it became the workshop of the world. And it's the American English-speaking union that should be the dominant power in the world. So that was the empire. Now, who was their political operative? It was Teddy Roosevelt. And I'm glad to see Kinzer include Roosevelt there because Roosevelt gets a pass all the time.
Mhm.
The Greenies give him a pass because they say he was an environmentalist. The anti-Wall Street guys give him a pass because they say he was a trust buster. He wasn't a trust buster. He just made sure that the right forces became the trusts. And Roosevelt was gung-ho as an imperialist, but more importantly, as a British, pro-British. Roosevelt purchased almost every copy of Mahon's book because it wasn't exactly a bestseller. And Roosevelt purchased the copies and gave them out to every member of the Congress and to many people in the media with the idea that the United States should become part of the empire. Now, when he did this, this was in the midst of a fight of a revival of the Lincoln Republican, the anti-free trade faction, the anti-imperial faction, centered around William McKinley. And McKinley, with his tariff policy, before he was president, was seen as a great threat to the British Empire. So what did they do? They set up things called the Cobden Clubs in England and in the United States, which were designed to promote free trade. And in doing that, to attack the idea that government should have any say at all in credit policy, monetary policy, trade policy. And they set up the economic school in London, the London School of Economics, and their branch in the United States was the Chicago School. And the Chicago School was deployed extensively against McKinley in the 1896 election. Now, what's the irony here? McKinley ends up stuck with Teddy Roosevelt as his vice president in his second term in 1900. McKinley's shot and Teddy Roosevelt comes in and moves against. I mean, McKinley pushed through a tariff policy, which was extremely important. And it's economic nationalism, as that says, but it's not imperialism. It's the idea of sovereign nation states having a right to develop their own economies in collaboration with other nations. And instead, the real imperial faction around Teddy Roosevelt later tried to say that McKinley was the imperialist. So they turn history upside down. And that's where Hearst comes in, popularizing the idea that we are the civilizing force. We are the good guys. What we do is good. When we do disinformation, it's for good reasons, for the good. When we expose disinformation by the Russians or whomever else, it's because we have to fight for the good. Well, this is where you see the truth turned on its head. So I find it interesting that those three are essentially prototypes of what has come together. And then you just have to add in the technological breakthroughs that give Silicon Valley an element of control. And then put all of that together with the idea of the military-industrial complex, which, as I've always said on this program, is not just the military. It's the corporate cartels that use the military to enforce their globalized control. And that's what the economic hitmen are all about, the IMF, that they're there to make sure that nothing gets in the way of these corporate trusts that can dominate international trade.
Yeah, economic hitmen. Yeah, it made me. It reminds me of the health alteration committee that the CIA ran, which I think was involved in my father's early demise. The idea of economic hitmen being, these people that just go out and subtly destroy an economy, a culture, a people. This is a genocidal mindset that's just going to go out and take advantage of everything to the extent of destroying it all.
The economic hitman just took it on the chin over the weekend with the elections in the Philippines. Now, I'm not sure that Marcos will be a great president, but his father was one of the first modern regime change operations run by George Shultz on behalf of the International Monetary Fund. Because Ferdinand Marcos, I mean, maybe his wife did like shoes, but what Ferdinand Marcos was doing was integrating the islands of the Philippines with infrastructure. He was committed to the idea of developing the most modern technologies, raising wages, and not siding necessarily with the United States. And as a result, we ran the first color revolution, the Yellow Revolution of Cory Aquino was run against Marcos. He was run out. The Philippines became, once again, a part of the imperial reach of the United States into Asia. And in this election, while it wasn't the only issue, the son of Ferdinand Marcos made the point that the Philippines will be neutral between the United States and China, and that he's going to seek better relations with China. Now, one of my associates, you may have had him on at one time, Mike Billington, wrote an excellent article on the George Shultz deploys the hitmen to destroy the Philippines. And this was about the 1980, I think it was 1986 revolution, so-called. But it was a prototype of what was done later with color revolutions in Eastern Europe. So, we've been talking about a realignment. You and I and the Schiller Institute's been saying that we're seeing the former colonial countries finally seeing an opportunity to push back against the colonizers. And I think this is a perfect example. Marcos had a very big victory as president, and Duterte's daughter, who is another target of the globalists, had a large victory as the vice president. So, maybe we're seeing the worm turning as they speak.
Well, the Philippines would be an appropriate place for it after all the terrible history that we've imposed upon them. I wonder what happened to Duterte. Last time I was not aware of the recent election until you just told me, but I was aware that there was a substantial kind of a civil war going on with so-called Muslim terrorists fighting against the government, and then Duterte seemed to me was being caught in between and may have been forced to comply with international community hitmen's economic hitmen's program. What happened to Duterte that he wasn't running this time? Is it just term limits or what?
I think the main thing was that he was a little tired of the slander and the attacks on him, and decided he would step aside and continue to play a role as a civilian. And his daughter is now the vice president, so it's not as though he's removed entirely. But look, the insurgency in the Philippines is one of these ongoing Muslim operations, which is, these still, there are pockets of these around the world. And the question is, who's supporting them? Who's allowing them to continue to function? And we've written articles in the past that, especially in the Philippines, this has been used to attack the central government in the Philippines. And it was deployed against Duterte. Duterte thought a more important issue was dealing with the drug problem, because he knew that the drug money was going into the terrorists. So he was attacked internationally for cracking down on drug trafficking. But what do you do when you have a poor population where a significant portion of the youth are getting hooked on drugs, especially heroin, because they can't find decent jobs? And so I think this is really the issue that the people voted on. And they said, we'd rather have our own government act for the interests of the people of the Philippines than be in a proxy war against China. And that was one of the themes of Marcos's campaign. We don't want to be a proxy for the United States in Asia. Now, look who just decided they want to be a proxy for the United States. Japan, going all in right now to be part of the Quad. And now they're pulling South Korea in with them at the point that India is pulling out. So, you have this shift going on with the Biden administration and the British using Australia and Japan and South Korea to contain China. And they're bringing in Japan and South Korea because India is not playing ball with them.
Well, thanks for updating me on that. I a lot of times I feel like when I interview people, it's just to help me get updated on stuff that I haven't been able to cover myself, because I tell you, it's just it's quite something to dive into these subjects and find, lead after lead after lead, and I just have to follow them out. I don't have a choice. I can't just say no, I'm not going to investigate this. Once I see something I need to look into, and I guess that's part of who I am. But I appreciate your updating me, and I wish the new government of the Philippines success, and finally upturning the John Foster Dulles policy from way back in the beginning of the Cold War, that there is no middle ground, that nobody can there's no you can't do that.
Yeah.
You can't do that. We're not going to let you do that. You're either a commie or you're with us. Which one do you want to be? You want to be a commie, or you want to be one of us? And besides, we hate commies and we kill them as fast as we can. Yeah.
Well, John, today I did, for my update, I went over the escalation of the information warfare.
Mm-hmm.
And I picked up these two stories from May 4th and May 5th, one in the New York Times, the one that said U.S. intelligence was providing the intelligence that was used to kill Russian generals in Ukraine. And John Kirby, the Pentagon spokesman, said, well, yes, we provide them intelligence, but we don't tell them what to do with it, which is quite, well, I mean, it's quite a weasel's way out, but it doesn't fool anybody. The Russians know better. And the story in the Times said, well, it may be that the United States is not really doing that, but they're letting it be known that they're doing that to convince the Russians that we really are against them in Ukraine. So the Times tries to give itself a bit of a cover, give the United States a bit of a cover. But the story is that it's likely the case that the U.S. is providing active intelligence that's being used to fight in this war, which means the United States is not just running a proxy war, the United States is in it. Then the second story was on NBC about the targeting of the Moskva, the the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet,
right.
which was, now it appears as though it was destroyed by Ukrainian missiles, and that the targeting was largely the result of intelligence from the United States. And again, we don't know for sure if that's true. But what I talked about is, what kind of world is it when you have this kind of so-called hybrid warfare, intelligence warfare, at the center of provoking war and confrontation, and so that you don't really know exactly what's true or who's telling the truth or who to believe. And I just just jotted down a few issues that, if there really were an honest muckraking media in the United States, and I'm not there. Look, there are a lot of people who do a lot of good work. Like George Webb is one of them. People, Scott Ritter's doing brilliant work right now at exposing what's really going on in Ukraine. But this doesn't get into the mainstream. What about the Pulitzer Prize winning authors and the journalists who get the awards? Why are they not looking into some of these issues? Like, why, for example, won't anybody take up the issue of Nazis in the Ukrainian defense forces? They say Putin's exaggerating, or Putin's using this as an excuse. There's no real evidence. There's plenty of evidence. There's videos that are everywhere of Ukrainians with swastika tattoos, with Ukrainians sitting there reading Mein Kampf on the battle lines, talking about the Russians being Untermenschen, which is the word the Nazis used for Jews and Russians. Why isn't someone doing an expose of this? Because if you really did an expose, you'd have to demonstrate that the United States used the Nazi rat lines after World War II. And this is, again, going back to Dulles, to help some of the key Nazis escape prosecution. and become part of U.S. intelligence operations. Among these were Stefan Bandera, the leader of one of the Nazi movements inside Ukraine. And now they've got this whole story about him. Well, he was eventually targeted by Hitler because Hitler thought he was too much of a Ukrainian nationalist. Well, he did spend a little bit of time in a concentration camp, but then he was released because they needed his forces to fight against the Soviets during World War II. So his heirs, who openly march under banners of his picture, his group, which was opposed to having Russians and Romanians and Poles and Hungarians and Jews in Ukraine, is backed by the leaders of the most ferocious fighters in the Ukrainian military and defense forces. Why doesn't someone just expose that? 6, 7 years ago, there were stories about it. Now they're covering it up because they don't want to give Putin some credibility. Then, just look, false flags in Syria, the cover-up of the OPCW, the Prohibition on Chemical Weapons Organization, that suppressed its own experts who said there was no evidence of Assad using chemical weapons in Syria. What about the FBI role in the Gretchen Whitmer kidnapping? This is now everywhere, that the FBI essentially took a couple, there may have been a couple of dupes who really thought they were going to kidnap her, but it was all run by these FBI infiltrators. And then, of course, what about the Hunter Biden laptop and the fact that the new Tsarina disinformation is a person who tried to cover up for the defense or the intelligence community, which said that the Hunter Biden laptop story was a Trump-Russian disinformation story. And then, of course, they still haven't apologized for the Christopher Steele dossier. So you put all this together and you ask yourself, is the United States government, or should we say the administration and the intelligence services, the biggest disinformation campaign in the world? And I think the answer is yes. And that's why we may be going into World War III.
It's horrific, and it's hard to believe that this could happen in the 21st century with all of these resources that we have, and the internet, and we have the media, the alternative media. We've got new services popping up all the time. Odyssey, Rockfin, BitChute. All of these places are available, but they're not getting through to the American people. This was a discussion I had with Garland Nixon last night. And I think if we're looking for somebody that can do it, I think Garland is somebody that can do it, because he's got an existing presence, not only on Fox, but also from RT, but also, a Pacifica Radio. He's big there. And he is with us. I mean, he is the only big possibility I see. I do appreciate your kind words, your encouragement about George Webb, because he's had a hard struggle to get some visibility. Neighborhood News Studio is really trying to help him get seen more, and I think that's a good thing. So thank you for that. And this business of disinformation against the American people is absolutely the worst thing that we can have. It just like William Randolph Hearst. It's the same thing in that William Randolph Hearst did not give a darn about the truth. He did not care what the truth was. All he wanted to know was what is the most extreme, gory story or horrific, tragedy, or most inflaming, story that they can make up and print on the front page to achieve their ends, which is to sell more papers. And so by appealing only to the emotions and the curiosity of the average person, he was able to get an almost complete monopoly on public opinion. And that public opinion then was used to support the war, even though it was based completely on falsehoods. Now, is that not exactly what's happening right now?
Well, I'm not sure that Hearst's only interest was to make money on selling papers. I think he was so tightly integrated into the imperial forces that he had many, many other areas of making money than the newspaper.
Oh, yeah.
But getting the public support for the war was what paved the way for all those other enterprises.
Mhm.
And that's what made him so popular. Now, you look at the effort by CNN to support the war. CNN just threw away, what was it, $100 million on an effort to provide a web page or a website where they could expand their lying. And it all collapsed because people don't believe them anymore. The people who believe CNN don't really need CNN. They have their own lying networks that they can spread their lies back and forth. MSNBC is collapsing. The New York Times continues to function because they're known as the paper of record. So people, even people who don't like them, read them to see what they're saying. But I think the big problem is the lack of interest in the truth because of the deception that's been done, the lies, the cover up, the censoring, the attempt to say that you can't believe anybody. It causes people to look toward the smallest local concerns that they think they might be able to control. And this is deliberate, whether it's geopolitics to pit nations against each other so that they're fighting for a smaller and smaller opportunity for a smaller entity, or identity politics in the United States where you divide people up into small groups and fight against each other when they're all being attacked by this blob that sits on top of it. So I think they've created an apathy, a disinterest, because people don't know where to look for the truth, and they don't really think it's worth their time to do it because they think even if they knew the truth, who could they talk to? John, I'm sure you have this phenomena for you. People say, well, I agree with you, but I can't get anyone in my family to listen to me.
Oh,
Do
boy.
you have people say that to you?
Oh, well, his name is David Cranmer Underdown, and he may be watching today, but you know that you just described him perfectly. And
Well,
he suffers with it because he's right in the middle of his own research, which keeps exploding and exploding. And he'll be on my show Wednesday night, by the way, at 8 p.m. Eastern time. He is exactly who you're talking about, and it's. But he is making incredible progress in tying together the disparate portions of our history as well as our present, deep state, whatever you want to call it. He's doing great.
I get emails, so many emails these days from people who say, thank you so much for presenting the truth. How do I get other people to learn that this is true?
Mm-hmm.
And what I tell them is you've got to work at it, but you've got to put it in a way that actually touches them on a higher level, not just the facts. People aren't convinced by the facts because they say, well, you have your facts and I have my facts, and which of course isn't true. But the question is there some higher faculty in human beings that enables them to think beyond the most immediate concern and think about what their life, what's the meaning of their life? And this is what I think Lyndon LaRouche hit upon that made him such a threat, because he had all the facts. If you had I'm sorry you never had a chance to talk with him. You could bring up almost any subject, and he could talk about it, at length, in depth. But that's not what he did in his teaching. What he did in his teaching is he challenged people to think for themselves as human beings who had a concern beyond their mortal existence. And if we can create in our fellow citizens a sense that we're living not just for our own immediate experiences and pleasures today, but that our life has to have some transcendent meaning in the course of history. That's what it means to be human. We're leaving something better behind than was there when we were brought into this world. If you get people to think that way, then it becomes important for them to know what's right and what's wrong. Who do I trust? Who can I trust? Well, start with yourself. Can you trust yourself to make the right assessment? And I think if you really get down to it, people say, I know what I like, I know what I don't like, but I don't know how to move people to do what I want to do. And I think it's that the emotional, empathetic side of human reason that we have to appeal to, that we have some purpose in life beyond our own success. And we have to define a successful life not on all the possessions I was able to grab, because when you go, you can't take them with you. But a successful life is when you touch the lives of other people that you didn't even know by doing something that makes their future better. And that's what Lyndon LaRouche gave to me and a bunch of other people my age who were recruited by him in the late 60s, early 70s. And I think that's what our influence comes from.
That's a lot of beautiful stuff, and I ache for that. It hurts me to see the desolation, of our media, the desolation of anything that's sold to the media, to the people, as art or music or high, philosophy. It is designed. It's the negative side, of propaganda. And what it does is kind of enforces the nothingness, the idea that there's nothing after life, and so just do whatever you want. That emanates from the British, the Tavistock system, and before.
And that goes back before Tavistock, because
Yeah.
that was totally there in John Locke, in Thomas Hobbes. It was an attack on people like Erasmus, an attack on Thomas More, an attack on the Shakespearean tradition, to basically say that, look, we're all animals, and what we can aspire to is a bigger piece of the pie for ourselves. And that's the Benthamite hedonistic calculus. That there's no higher good than what makes you feel good at the moment. And how many of our fellow citizens are trapped into thinking that way and looking for an escape, where work is no longer a pleasure. You get no sense of satisfaction from the work you're doing, except if you get a decent paycheck and it helps you to escape from the world when you can take vacations or go home at night and shut out the world and pour yourself a drink and put on the television. So the idea that human endeavor itself is good, and that you don't want to retire because you want to keep doing things that will improve the world. That's the way our founding fathers talked about the idea of for ourselves and our posterity in the preamble of the Constitution. We have institutions of government which give you the opportunity to leave that behind. That's what pursuit of happiness means. And that's in explicit contrast to Locke and property, where they changed in the Declaration of Independence to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, as opposed to life, liberty, and property, which was the Constitution of North Carolina drafted by John Locke. So we have this tradition. It's a philosophical tradition. And by the way, there were some Englishmen who understood this, like Jonathan Swift, who was brutal in attacking the British empiricism. One of my favorite examples is in Gulliver's Travels, where Gulliver goes to a place where they're trying to extract sunbeams from cucumbers. And you look at the environmentalists today, that's what we see. You had Shakespeare, you had Marlowe. You had actually a group of founding fathers who were philosophical. Franklin set up the American Philosophical Society. He set up the Postal Service so that we could have treatises circulated among the founding fathers so they could read them. This is what the Federalist Papers were about. People going to bars, instead of talking about fantasy football statistics, they went into bars and had fights over the difference between monarchy, democracy, and a republic. So can we get back there? I think we have to. It's not a choice. If we don't, we're not going to have a country.
It was a brief internet glitch there, but I heard what you're saying, and yeah, what can we do now? The whole this is the totalitarianism that is now coming in, and the technological totalitarianism. Like I was talking about my YouTube channel, if somebody gives me a strike, it's not from a human being, it's from AI having read some language that it interpreted as being, against their community policies, and so you get a strike. No human involved. This is the technological nightmare that we've all been told about is coming from Huxley and Orwell and everybody else. Hey, it's coming, guys. Look what's coming. The future of humanity is a boot on the head, on the neck of on your neck forever. They told us that, and this thing is coming now. And the lack of attention by our leadership to philosophy and to the things that you pointed out so well, the eloquence of you and the Schiller people is beautiful. I love to read the old stuff. Like you talk about Mike Billington's column on George P. Shultz having been the hitman for the Philippines. I didn't know that. I saw it on Twitter this morning. It was posted in Helga Zepp-LaRouche's Twitter column. And I said, wow, I got to go and read that, And it's like, here I am, I'm my dad's son, the two football players at Loomis, and one went this way and the other went that way. And, I'm here to say, George P. Shultz's way is the wrong way for humanity. And we need to go back to the right way and the true flag and the values that you just spoke about. I'd love to meet Anton Chaikin sometime, by the way, if I can put in a hint. I'd just be delighted. He's such a brilliant man, and I'm grateful for all of his work as well.
Well, I can see if there's a possibility to get him in touch with you, but I can't promise anything.
I know.
But the key to this really is the shift that occurred after the assassination of Kennedy. And I was just thinking about from myself what that meant. And there's a scene at the beginning of Oliver Stone's movie Born on the 4th of July, where it's before the Vietnam War. It's a sunny summer afternoon in suburbia, and everything looks just so picturesque. And then look what happened after the Vietnam War and the changes that occurred. Now, this is just a momentary image, but I think if you can freeze in time the idea that the first part of the post-war period, the veterans came home and they wanted to make up for lost time. And unfortunately, we had the corporations unite with Madison Avenue to sell a false bill of goods. Consume, become a consumer. Let's instead of the idea of taking the tanks and turn them into tractors, the idea was turn them into fancy cars, give everybody the opportunity to live in the suburbs. That's not to say urban life is necessarily better than suburban life, because there are a lot of benefits to suburban life. But what came with it was a culture of keeping up with the neighbors, wanting to be, because of McCarthyism, wanting to be overheard saying the right thing, being afraid that someone might think you were a communist if you were critical of some program of government. So, we had a subtle but powerful shift. And when I say subtle, it happened without people knowing it, but they were being hit over the head with a club. And that's what the McCarthyism was about. Kennedy was the last potential bulwark against it, not just himself, but as LaRouche said, Kennedy represented the hopes of that generation of veterans to be able to realize the idea of the four freedoms of Roosevelt, of taking the powerful economy that was built up during the war and use it in peacetime, not just in the United States, but to fulfill the anti-colonial commitment of the American Revolution. And if there's one thing that we've lost that's terrible, it's that we became part of the colonizers. Not that we owned other countries, with the minor exceptions, but that we used free trade to control them. And we used the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to control them. And then we used the ideology that was pumped out of the university institutions to brainwash their young people to a false idea of the American system. And so we've lost that. Now, there was a certain amount of innocence to that because it didn't just happen. It was a big intellectual fight over several hundred years. You know, the American Revolution was 50 years in the making. And if you trace the history of Franklin, you get a sense of that Franklin spent a lot of time trying to convince the British to give us equal standing with the people of England. And at a certain point, he realized the people of England had no standing, and the United States had to become a separate republic. Then we had to fight the War of 1812, the Civil War, the assassination of leaders like Lincoln, Garfield, who was a Lincoln Republican, McKinley, Franklin Roosevelt's fight to get through programs like Glass-Steagall, the fight to convince the Americans that we had to get into World War II, not on the side of the British, but against the Nazis and against the Japanese, against the imperial forces. And then after Roosevelt's death, Truman got pulled in by Churchill. And we've been fighting the empire ever since, and we're not even fighting it now, we're a part of it. So, you know, that brief history, the American system still exists as an idea. The principles of that are enshrined in our founding documents. The benefits of that can be seen by studying the history of the growth of the American system and how we created a middle class. And you know, now we see the extremes of wealth. We see the middle class collapsing. Just yesterday, there was Grantham, the British forecaster, said that don't worry so much about the collapse of the stock market. It's going to happen. The collapse of the real estate market is the thing you should really be worried about. And how many people owning a home today think that by virtue of owning a home and the price continuing to go up, lower interest rates, that's their pathway to a secure future? That could get blown up in a minute. And that's what Grantham is warning about. So, you know, maybe that will cause people to think about the fact that we have to move back to these founding principles.
Now, wait a minute. Didn't we already establish that it's foolish to dwell on constitutional niceties when vital interests are at stake? I mean, we decided that in 1898. So
Yeah.
the hell with the Constitution. Come on, let's get busy. Let's look at reality here. The reality is, you know, we got, you know, it's a messy world. You can't make an omelet without breaking some eggs, and you know, some of those eggs, you know, might be friends of yours, but you got to do it. You got to do it. That you said so many things that I don't want to get off on what I just said. Forgive me, but I want to go
That's
back.
important because, John, that's the rules-based order.
Yeah.
The rules-based order is we're going to do what's good for the most powerful, not what's good for everyone, not what's good based on principle, natural law, real religion. You know, the people who call themselves Christians and yet turn a blind eye to what's being done in the name of American foreign policy. You know, this is where you see how we are losing our control over what used to be a good country.
Well, that's exactly what Alan Dulles meant when he said, "I am a Calvinist." He meant I understand, you know, human rights. I understand, you know, the principles of morality. They just don't apply outside of my personal judgment of who is a good Calvinist. If you're not, then you're just taking up space, and I'm going to do whatever I please with regard.
In particular, what he liked about Calvinism was the idea of the chosen.
Yeah.
That you have no choice in the matter. God either chose you to be rich and prosperous and happy, or he didn't. And if he didn't, well, play by the rules, and we'll give you a few crumbs here and there. And that's what you mean by Calvinism, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Tulip. Back to see the USA in your Chevrolet.
Yeah.
the 50s. You don't need to do that hand crank, ma'am, anymore. We got an electric, motor on a washing machine. You just buy this and you'll never have to have, bicep strength again. You can just relax and be beautiful. And, when your husband comes home and you can hand him his drink, you'll feel a lot sexier than you would if you had built up your biceps by running that nasty machine. And, that kind of salesmanship of just been poured on us, as you say, that is part of the PSYOP, exactly what you said, that you need to spend whatever little extra money you got on something essential to keep up with the Joneses.
Something visible,
or
visible to the neighbors.
Or clothes, you've got to have a new suit, you got to have new clothes, you got to have new shoes, you got to be stylish, you can't wear that tie this year, you got to get a new tie. Thin ties are in this year, don't you know that? Don't look like a dummy. Come on, buy a new tie. You don't want to look like a dummy. We're talking about corporate. You might not get that job just because you wore the wrong tie, and that kind of crap. That's Disney too, and Tomorrowland, remember? And, you're going to have everything you need. You're going to have a car that you're going to drive in the water, you drive across the river in your car. that, and then the rocket ships and all of this, we're going to go to Mars. We're going to, have atomic power and go to Pluto. All of that garbage was foisted upon us instead of letting us build up our own wealth. It's like we the people that built, America were building their own wealth. These people that went out and did the China trading, even you can condemn the subject to which they did, whether, all of the bad stuff, but the good stuff too, that with that, they built cities, they built, Baltimore, they built Canton, Ohio, they built, all around this place they built, and people profited from it. Even if they didn't get a piece of the big pie, at least their lives are better. And that gets back to what you were saying about each generation. And I love the American anthem, the song that should be our national anthem, I think, has a verse that goes, each generation from plains to distant shore, with what they were given, were determined to leave more. And that is the American spirit. That's the spirit that you're calling up, and I'm calling up, and let's get back to that. Let's get back to our founding principles and throw these people out. Just get rid of them. They're all a plague on both your houses, and get rid of both the houses, and let's go back to our foundation. Let's go back to our structure, our Constitution, our Declaration of Independence, and the writings of our founding fathers. Unfortunately, at that time, the majority of the world did buy the bullshit about there being separate races and separate, that some races have better intellectual abilities and you shouldn't trust, those people with government, and that stupid, meme or whatever you want to call it still exists, and it still has a huge impact, in people's thinking. Even subconsciously they think, oh, well, gosh, we can't let them get in charge of this. We've got to make sure and keep control. That mentality comes from these I don't know. Those are the ones that end up in charge of the financial system of the world, because they're vicious enough to just keep climbing and climbing and climbing till they get there.
They also figured out how to co-opt the people of different races and different ethnicities. You look at the British Empire recruiting a whole group of overseers from India, who they sent into South Africa to run the plantations there. You look at the way the British studied the collapse of the Roman Empire and said, well, we're not going to make the same mistake. And that's why the British have now an Indian finance minister who's as vicious against the poor people as any Anglo-Saxon could be. So, it's the system. That's the point. The system has perpetuated itself, the imperial system. And it's embedded in the bones of people who go to Eton and Oxford and Cambridge. And we used to have something different, but that they brought in that British system into American education. And the idea of success in American education is to learn how to propitiate the right people who can get you ahead. And that's deadly.
Yeah. Yeah. Audrey Smith says hegemony, and that's what it is. It's hegemony,
Yeah.
or the pyramid. And use what little talent you have to scramble up one level of the pyramid so that your kid might get to go to a better school, or might be able to bring his kid up to the next level. And I contrast that with what's a quote from John Adams that I love, and he said, I think I have it right, it's approximately right. I am a soldier so that my son can be an engineer, so that his son can be an artist.
Yeah.
I love that, because that's where I think, my heart is I instead of studying all of this stuff and trying to solve all these riddles and put dots together, I'd rather be creating. I'm a creative type of person. And so my energy is going into this because I just desperately need this. We need this problem solved. And I'm throwing all my energy at it right now. But really, honestly, I think all of us are in our hearts are really artists, and we are creative. And each one of us is unique as the fingerprints that we have. We are unique souls. And to suppress the growth of our souls is the method of this of this system, this corrupt system that you spoke of.
Yeah. I think that's right. Very true.
Well, Harley, we've ranged all over the place this morning, and I once again have the feeling that I'd love to go on for another couple hours with you. It's just so stimulating and so educational. So, but with my deep thanks, I think we'll have to wrap it up here.
Okay. Well, it's good talking with you again, John. I'll see you in 2 weeks.
Okay. Thanks, Harley. Thanks, everybody else. And stay tuned for George Webb. All right, we'll wait for John to. Oh, I think I can.
Sorry, guys.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, guys. Great show.
Okay,
Excellent show. Amazing stuff. Thank you, Harley. Thank you, John. We continue on here at neighborhoodnewsstudio.com. If you're watching on one of John's, the McDuff YouTube channels, those will be removed here momentarily. So please do join us over at neighborhoodnewsstudio.com. If you're watching there on YouTube, you'll see your feed go away, but we will be keeping the day going here with all of our great journalists, George, Mark, Chris, Peter Duke, so many. So you will be losing your live feed there on YouTube, but do please join us at neighborhoodnewsstudio.com. John, any thoughts on that last show on Harley and
I want
John's
to
comments,
underline one of the last things that Harley said about the